All right, welcome to another IAEI News Live. I'm Thomas Dimitrovich, and today's topic are 2023 code changes that significantly impact residential dwelling unit applications, and it all starts now. All right, welcome back. So this is a recorded session because right now I'm actually traveling, again, talking about electrical safety, and this topic is a part of my discussion for tomorrow, which is Tuesday, which is why I can't be live right now. So this is recorded, and I'm basically going to be going to share with you something that I'm talking about right now at a venue where we're talking electrical safety and safe work practices and National Electrical Code and all that great stuff. So what we're going to focus on are 2023. We're going to look at the 2023 code changes, and quite frankly, when you look at some of these requirements or some of these applications, there you'll see that there is a change that is going on over maybe even sometimes in some cases the last two cycles. So what some of the items that we're going to cover today are not just new changes. They are a continuation of a process of identifying hazards and addressing them. So that's what I want to talk about today. So let's kick this off by taking a look at 2023 code changes that impact on residential applications. And all right, here we go. Okay, so a few of the areas that service entrance equipment, we saw changes during the 2020 code, 2017, 2020, and into the 2023 code cycle. Areas of discussion include 6 disconnect rule, surge, requirements. We saw 2020 have new surge requirements that directly impact service entrance equipment. There's working space requirements, but I didn't throw that into this discussion because I just think that, I don't know, in my opinion, the working space area is probably a lot more of an impact on commercial applications than it is residential dwelling unit applications. But we could make an argument for multifamily type of applications, but I'm leaving that out for now. The emergency disconnect we saw over the last 3 cycles, or over the last 2 cycles, and I say 3 meaning the 2023 code cycle. So for at least 3 cycles now, we have seen changes that directly try to address first responders. If you recall, and we'll get into this, but if you'll recall, the first round, which failed actually at the floor of the annual meeting, I think they called it the firefighters disconnect. And I know we had some debates around that and those requirements. And so it failed the first time around, it passed the second time around, and as you're going to see, it's starting to expand its application. And we've got to be thinking about this emergency disconnect, because if you're not in certain applications, and we're trying to address some areas where it can be a challenge, you'll see how it's going to impact possibly some of your design. AFCI and GFCI, I mean, a residential discussion of code changes would not be wouldn't be anything if it didn't include AFCI and GFCIs 210.8 and 210.12. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to hit surge. It saw in an introduction in the 2020 code. We saw some focus around surge requirements, and the 2023 code cycle is not going to disappoint in that regard. And islands and peninsulas, you're going to see a significant change there. And also, not included here, I forgot, I'm going to hit some of the lighting requirements. So hopefully if we have some time, there are some requirements with regard to there's a permission and allocation to use a wireless controller. And I want to talk a little bit about that because I think that's going to see an impact possibly, especially into the future. There's some changes that happened last cycle and maybe some changes that didn't happen this cycle that some people wanted to see happen. And it may impact moving on in the forward. So we're going to talk about those lighting controls as well. All right. So when you think about residential code changes, you got to think about the requirements that are out there that impact your design, that impact maybe the product that you have to install. For example, tamper-resistant receptacles, a good example in my opinion, where you would say if you put a standard receptacle in an application where all of a sudden you might have a new requirement that required a tamper-resistant. It's not going to change the fact that you have a receptacle where you have the receptacle. It's just what type of receptacle is permitted to be installed there. AFCIs and GFCIs, I could say that may impact your design. For example, if you do a lot of shared neutrals and you don't want to do 2-pole breakers, but you want to do single pole breakers, in some applications, you may have to change how you do your wiring practices. I know many contractors changed their wiring practices because of the technologies of AFCIs and GFCIs for a lot of different reasons. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But when you think about code changes, think about it through the eyes of your design and think about it through the eyes of maybe a requirement for a specific product. And you can't forget about state adoption. Not every state adopts January 1st, 2023. So there's a process. There are still states on 17 code, believe it or not. And there are still jurisdictions that don't adopt a code. So be mindful that all of that makes a difference, especially if you are, if you're looking at, if you have a new room that requires AFCI, or you have a new area that requires GFCI, you may want to adjust how you design and lay out your system to minimize impact in case there's a trip on that circuit. Minimize leakage currents in your applications. We saw that in Article 555. Go take a look at the ground fault requirements in Article 555 for marinas. We made some, I think, interesting approaches to tiered levels of ground fault protection. GFCI, ground fault protection of equipment at 30 milliamps, ground fault protection of 100 milliamps. So, and we did that because of the concern for leakage currents and things of that nature. So we have that elevated leakage current allowance. But in any case, in some cases, it may impact your design. Now, let's talk about, I'm going to kick this off with 210.8. There are a lot of changes in 210.8 as usual, and I'm sure that if you do residential dwelling units, and I'll say, I'm going to walk into commercial applications, 210.8b as well. I might as well hit that. I can just quickly go down through some of those changes. That's not a big deal. All right, so let's take a look. Boom. So you'll see that 210.8, I just have to get to the right location here, /70 next. If you want to follow along, remember you can go to www.nfpa.org/70 next, and you can see the first and second draft. If you really want to understand the code changes and you're looking at NFPA's website, you've got to look at the first draft and the second draft. You can't just go to the second draft unless you know exactly all the words for each of these sections. The second draft may not provide you with the underline and strikeout for the changes that occurred in the first draft that didn't change in the second draft. So keep that in mind. Okay, so Dwelling units, other than dwelling units, crawl space, lighting outlets, crawl space did not change. Specific appliances, significant change there. Equipment requiring servicing, not really a big significant change there. I think it's pretty much, we may have made some minor changes. And then outdoor outlets, that's the point of contention for everybody. I know that, and I know the compatibility concerns with HVAC equipment is out there. I'll show you what's going on with that. And we'll talk a little bit about temporary interim amendments, TIAs, that were passed. All right, so in the parent text of 210.8, now you might say, in reality, you might say, look, Tom, GFCIs, we're going to buy listed GFCIs anyway. But in the code, we didn't really point out that the ground fault circuit interrupter has to be listed. In fact, we didn't point out in any previous editions that a molded case circuit breaker had to be listed. So those changes are a part of the 2023 code cycle. Not that you would have to... not that it would, you probably already bought listed circuit breakers. You probably already purchased listed ground fault circuit interrupters. So not necessarily a big change, but it is a level of awareness that they have to be listed. You'll see changes where they removed ground fault circuit interrupter and they used the acronym. Not a big deal, in my opinion, but just something. So here's what I think. You've got to at least understand that change was put in place, so that you got to understand that when you're going to see GFCI a lot and you're going to see AFCI a lot, and if you don't know what the acronym is, then you've got to go find the first usage of it. So I have a love-hate relationship with this whole acronym. First time you use it, then you use the acronym afterwards, and I just ran across that in. I think it was Article 625. I can't remember which article I was looking at. There was an acronym they were using, and I'm like, what is that acronym? And I had to go up through the code section, through the whole article to find the first use. So just, again, be mindful that if there's an acronym in the code, you may see an acronym and you wonder, well, it's not defined. What does that acronym mean? You may have to search for it, unfortunately. So maybe that's the power of NFPA Link. I don't know, but and the whole online experience. But just be mindful of that. So we removed the language for measuring for measurements passing through a window. If you think about, that's always been a point of contention. So the measurements. Drop my glasses. the measurements for measuring now, and we're going to talk a little bit about this too, but how do I say this? When we have GFCI requirements, there's the determination of what receptacles require GFCI protection is typically the distance of the receptacle from the sink, right? So, and 210.8a or 210.8 tells us, the parent text, that for the purposes of the section, the distance from receptacles shall be measured as the shortest path the power supply cord connected to the receptacle would follow without piercing a floor, wall, ceiling, or fixed barrier. So we removed window. And in the last cycle, remember, in 2020, we took out that whole concept of a doorway. And the reason we took the door, we had to address the door, was because the garage, the appliance garages have a door on them, and if there's a receptacle on the countertop within 6 foot of that sink, and it's inside the appliance garage, somebody could say, look, that the receptacle behind that door for the garage, appliance garage, does not need to be GFCI protected. That was not our intent. Somebody could say that the receptacle under the sink, because the cord would have to go through the door, does not need to be GFCI protected. So those examples made it confusing. And we said, look, you know what? We're just going to remove that reference to a door. Well, we had the same issue with windows. And in my opinion, you might say that sometimes those pass-throughs, you might call it a window. I'm not sure if I'd call it a window. If I look at the Webster definition of what a window is, there's enough room there for a debate and an argument. And we said, you know what, we're just removing it. So how do you address a problem? What panel 2 is apparently saying is, look, okay, if you have a problem with the word window, if you're confused with what a window is, then you know what, we're removing it. You don't know what a door is, and if you want to try to use the door as an excuse, we're taking the door out. So now the way it's reading for purposes of measurement, the distance from the receptacle is measured through the shortest path power supply cord connected to the receptacle would follow without piercing a floor, a wall, a ceiling, or a fixed barrier. So we try to add clarity. That's sort of what's going on in that arena. Okay, so A, dwelling units. Now, one of the things that we did, if you look at how do I say this? So kitchens. Let's start with kitchens. If the previous language said where the receptacles are installed to serve the countertop surfaces, we removed that language and just said if you have a receptacle in a kitchen, and remember the parent text in A says 125 volt through 250 volt receptacles installed in these locations, supplied by a single phase branch circuit rated 150 volts or less to ground. These have to be ground fault protection. These are receptacle outlets. If you have a receptacle outlet in a kitchen, it's going to be GFCI protected. Now the challenges there are what's a part of the kitchen and what's not. So that's going to be the debate, right? What area, what is the kitchen, and what receptacle is, especially sometimes on some of these walls where you might move out of the kitchen and maybe to a breakfast nook or something like that. So there's going to be the debate. Is that part of the kitchen? Is it not part of the kitchen? That one receptacle that's on the wall, is that a part of the kitchen or is it in the breakfast nook? Those are all the things, the debates that are going to happen, I'm sure. But any receptacle in a kitchen, GFCI protected. Then what we did was we took the language, if you remember, in 210.8b, in 210.8b last cycle, I believe it was last cycle, we said, in addition to kitchens, we had areas with sinks and permanent provisions for food preparation, beverage preparation, or cooking. And it was the or cooking and not the and cooking that gets you out of saying it's a kitchen. So you may not have cooking provisions, but you have food preparation. And that was a key in to say you need to GFCI protect. And the target there really were like those Starbucks stations and similar. Well, somebody said, well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Does the electron know that it's not in a dwelling unit if I have an area like that? And the electrons, I hate to break it to you, they're not that smart. So they're lazy and they always love to party. So any place where there's a fault, they just love to go there and they find the shortest paths. So in any case, they take all paths. So what we did in A was we said, areas with sinks and permanent provisions for food preparation, beverage preparation, and then there's the or cooking. So we took the language from B and we placed it in A. In my opinion, very little impact in residential applications, in my opinion. Because you asked for it, I gave it to you. All right, so All exceptions were located. Now, this is not a big change, but just be mindful that all of the exceptions are now placed at the end. And here's what we recognized. For example, remember we had an exception for receptacles supplying only a permanently installed, what we used to have fire alarm or burglar alarm system are not required. And it was for the exception to basements. So somebody on the panel asked the question, what if the burglar alarm is in the garage? What if the burglar alarm is in my laundry? I need the GFCI protected. But then if you go back to the article that addressed, say, fire alarms, there was already the requirement that you can't put those on a GFCI. So here's what we did. Fire alarms were already covered. So we removed that. In 760, 41, and 121, their fire alarms are already addressed. So we didn't have to put the exception in 210.8A for fire alarms because it's already in 760. If you have a fire alarm, you're not allowed to put it on a GFCI. So we took that reference out. But there's nothing in the National Electrical Code that dealt with, you would call it, what the code has historically called was burglar alarms, but we call that premises security system. That aligns with other codes and standards. So the premises security system is not currently addressed in the National Electrical Code. I can't go to like an equivalent 760.41 or 760.121 and find that you can't put those on a GFCI. So we left that in, but we removed the fire alarm. So the way the exception reads now is a receptacle supplying only permanently installed premises security system shall be permitted to omit ground fault circuit and outdoor protection. But it's not just for basements. I don't care where that's at. You don't need to put GFCI protection for that premises security system. All right, so that is that's basically what we did there. Not a big change, but something that you need to be aware of. And then in the exceptions, they added some new definitions for weight supporting ceiling receptacles and then weight supporting attachment fittings. We just basically changed the terminology, and it's the same. So not as big of a deal there. So those were the changes that we saw in 210.8A. And I believe, I would say out of all of those, significant change, kitchens. Expansion in kitchens, that's the one that I would argue is the significant change in 210.8A for dwelling units. So all receptacles, and that picks up any of those appliances, anything that's plugged in. All right, so we already talked about this. Already talked about that. Moving the exceptions to the end. That was a style manual thing, NEC style manual. And it streamlined those exceptions as well. And it expanded those exceptions. So there was another one. Yeah, that was the other one. Exception number 1. Remember the exception for readily accessible. And it was we expanded. I think we expanded that for snow melting, de-icing. So it's receptacles that are not readily accessible and are supplied by a branch circuit dedicated to electric snow melting, de-icing, or piping and vessel heating. Shall be installed in accordance with 426.28 as applicable. Now we also in B. That same receptor, that same one. Remember, the exception was for rooftops. We removed that reference to rooftops. We said, hey, if it's serving this equipment, then it's going to need to be GFCI protected, regardless if it's on rooftops. So we sort of made that generic. And I think the other one was for outdoors. I think it was an exception to 3, if I'm not mistaken. You're going to have to check that for me. But I know we made a slight tweak for that. There was a new exception for 4 factory installed receptacles that are not readily accessible. Now, this one here, I think that they're talking about those ceiling fans, like the in the bathroom, where you have the fan that that does your exhaust. If you take the covers off, there's a little two-prong receptacle in there that's meant for plugging in that fan. That's doesn't need to be GFCI protected, and apparently somebody was requiring it. Else we probably wouldn't have got the public input and public comment. So we added clarity that those factory installed receptacles that are not readily accessible and are mounted internally to bathroom exhaust fans do not need to be GFCI protected. Okay, so B, let's talk just real quickly about other than dwelling units. We separated out 2 and 3. So remember, 2 was kitchens and areas with sinks and fluid. We just moved those into 2 separate, so there's no technical change there. We just moved those into two individual. And I know I shouldn't even be talking about this, but I'm going to hit it anyway. There's a new list item 4 for buffet serving areas that have permanent provisions for food serving, beverage serving, and cooking. So there's a new item 4. List item 7, sinks where receptacle cords and plugs are stationary. They added, so now this is the concept, and this is the reason why I wanted to talk about this, because I think, in my opinion, you're probably going to see something along the dwelling unit side. So what happens in B doesn't just stay in B. It influences changes in A. So the discussion that we had at Code Panel 2 was around the fact that the hazard is not the receptacle. That's just a measurement method to identify what needs to be GFCI protected and what doesn't need to be GFCI protected. The hazard's really around the appliance. So what we did in B was we said, look, sinks where receptacles are cord and plug connected, fixed or stationary appliances are installed within 6 foot. So it's not the receptacle, it's also if the appliance, the receptacle could be 7 feet away from the sink, but if the appliance is within 6 feet of the sink, then you need to GFCI protect it. So we're focusing on the appliances, and this is a lead in a little bit to the discussion that we're going to have in a little bit. That's going to be another impact to residential dwelling units. So that was 7. Now 8, simple change. Instead of damp and wet locations, it's damp or wet locations. And you know what? I think we missed it. Yeah, we missed it in A. We still say damp and wet locations in A. We fixed it in B. Gosh darn it. Don't you just hate that? When you get it in one, but you didn't get it in the other. Anyway, and then we added, list item 8 was cleaned up, right? But then list item 13 is new. Aquariums, bait wells, and similar open aquatic vessels or containers, such as tanks or bowls where receptacles are installed within 6 foot. Now, this is one of those that would be hard to migrate over to a dwelling unit. And for the reason that you don't know where someone's going to put an aquarium. But I'll tell you, you put an aquarium, and I know I had an aquarium, and you think about there's a heater, right, that's plugged into the wall outlet, and that heater, where does it go? Directly in the water. And there's a pump, which I would say, that's probably, the pumps I was experiencing, the unit was down and it was plastic tubing. So the heater though, directly in the water. And what am I doing? I'm in there cleaning tank. I'm moving things around, got my hands in the water while that heater is directly in that tank. If there was a problem with that heater, nobody is, I don't know what the knock on. There's no wood around here anymore. I don't have any reports of people getting electrocuted due to their residential dwelling unit aquarium, but we had good substantiation for aquariums, bait wells, and similar open aquatic vessels, and some interesting images of those applications where you have these receptacles. That's not necessarily a sink. But what's the difference? So, and you have a lot of electronic equipment. So you're going to see that. You see that in B. I don't know if you'll see that in A or not. And again, we move the exceptions down. So, okay. Now, this specific appliance. So think about this one. So crawl space lightings did not change. Specific appliances. Now, there's a debate. In regard to 422 is appliances, right? So 422 has requirements for that impact appliances. And they'll call out specific appliances like tire inflation machines, vending machines, sump pumps, etc. But 422 doesn't apply to the branch circuit. 422 focuses on the appliance. And this is actually, there's different opinions on this one. And I hesitate to even give you my opinion. But just look at 422 and think about what does its scope of work. Think about Article 210 and what is its scope of work. And I can tell you that the requirements that we're talking about in 210.8 D are focused on the branch circuit because that's the scope of 210. And what the hopes are is that for the branch circuit or an outlet, not a receptacle. So this is the importance of not putting, you can't say, well, that's already covered in 210.8A because 210.8A only covers receptacles. This is any outlet supplying a list of appliances. You have to GFCI protect. You have to provide that GFCI protection for that outlet that is supplying these appliances. And we created the list, right? We created a list and we've expanded it. So what you're seeing here is you have automotive vacuum machines, drinking water coolers and bottle fill stations, high pressure spray washing machines, tire inflation machines, vending machines, sump pumps, and dishwashers. Now, if you go back to Article 422, you're going to find that same list. Now, what Panel 2 did was added electric ranges, wall-mounted ovens, counter-mounted cooking units, clothes dryers, and microwave ovens. Now, I'll give you a reason why. Two things. First, we had CPSC deaths on these equipment, on those wall-mounted ovens, on those microwave ovens, clothes dryers. And remember the discussion earlier that we saw in 210.8B. It was and they made a change in 210.8B. It's the distance from the appliance to the sink. Now, one of the code panel members during our discussions, I think accurately pointed out that you don't need water. You don't need a proximity to water to be electrocuted on this equipment. And it's not just the failure of this equipment that drives the deaths, the GFCI requirement, or the data point of deaths. In some cases, in many cases, we had examples of people who were working on these appliances. And if you think about what is a definition of justified energized work, one of those reasons that you can perform energized work is for troubleshooting. And when you're trying to fix a microwave or fix a clothes dryer, you are probably troubleshooting and you can't turn it off. You can't just unplug it. Or if it's hardwired, you can't turn the circuit breaker off to establish an electrically safe work condition if you need to do testing and you're trying to figure out why the appliance isn't working. So we had a body count. We had people who were killed. We had qualified people who were working on it and unqualified people. And I'm not even going to entertain the discussion. You can do that on somewhere else on whether or not the qualified or the unqualified person deserves that protection. We had a number of deaths. Now, the other thing that this does, because remember in that discussion earlier when I talked about other than dwelling units, that they're doing the measurement from the appliance. If I have the appliance covered, so if you think about a residential kitchen, you probably have a range, an electric range. You might have a wall-mounted oven or a counter-mounted cooking unit, electric, obviously. Clothes dryers, definitely. Microwave ovens. Those, whether they're hardwired or receptacle, cord and plug connected. If they're cord and plug connected and they're in a kitchen, covered. But what about hardwiring? The hazard is not removed because you took the receptacle out of the picture. The hazard is not the receptacle. The hazard is what's plugged into the receptacle. And if I hardwire an appliance in to get out of the GFCI requirements, you haven't removed the hazard. The hazard is the appliance. And I know if I was an appliance manufacturer out there, I'd say, well, you can't call my product a hazard. But any product at its end of life, or if I'm going to do maintenance on it, think about the requirements. Where is it? We have equipment likely to be serviced. We have a receptacle requirement for that equipment. And what do we have? GFCI protection for those who are working on it with tools, who are going to be plugging into that receptacle, working on equipment that's required to be serviced, have space for servicing, HVAC equipment and others. We have to have GFCI protected receptacles. Well, this is no different. Very similar. I wouldn't say different, no different. It's not exactly the same, but it's very similar, in my opinion. So that's sort of the way the discussions went on panel 2. Again, I'm not speaking on behalf of panel 2. I'm just giving you my perspective, and it is my opinion, and my opinion only, not of IAEI, of anybody else. NFPA, Code Making Panel 2, NEMA, anybody. This is my opinion. I'm sharing with you the discussion that I was a part of. So that, I think, is a significant change. And I know it drove concerns about leakage current. So here's what happens with leakage when you put these types of requirements on. If any of these appliances use that equipment grounding conductor, it's going to cause a GFCI to trip. If it's not, obviously, we're not supposed to use the equipment grounding conductor for anything other than fault currents. So Article 250 tells us that. So are there some appliance manufacturers who are concerned about this? Yes, absolutely. But the appliance standards are changing, and many of the appliances are addressing this from a compatibility perspective. So that's all I'm going to say about that. That's all I have to say about that. All right. Outdoor outlets. So let's talk about outdoor outlets. So if I look at outdoor outlets, remember the concern on the outdoor outlets has been around the HVAC equipment. And we did have an exception for drives and those with variable frequency drives and those split units. And that exception expired for January 1st, 2023 in the 2020 code. We did not elect as a code panel during the process to put that in, but a TIA was developed and accepted in time. So you should, as long as the Standards Council accepted what the panel accepted, which I don't see any reason why they wouldn't, but there was an appeal, so I don't know what the results of that appeal are yet. We'll know any minute. But if all goes as I think it probably will, you'll probably see that same exception back in there for split units and those with adjustable frequency drive type of technologies. There are still a lot of HVAC equipment out there that works perfectly compatible, but there are some that have compatibility issues, and that is a point of debate and contention. All right, so let's talk about, that's pretty much 210.8 in a nutshell. So let's talk about 210.12. 210.12, they separated. So this is how the 2020 code was laid out. And in the 2023 code, they sort of reorganized, and this was actually Nihat Al-Sharif did a really good job, and he made a good argument that, and he tried to align it a little bit like we do with 210.8, You have A is means of protection, because there are different ways to achieve your AFCI protection. We'll talk about those. B was dwelling units. C is dormitory units, and then D was other occupancies. And then E dealt with the branch circuit wiring extensions, modifications, and replacements. So we reorganized 210.12 a little bit. We did do some expansion. I'll cover that, but we did not address the means of protection. So you have the first means of protection. I don't know why that right there is there, but in any case, the first is the listed combination type AFCI at the source of the branch circuit. The second one is a branch feeder plus an OBC AFCI, so you're ensuring the protection of the home run circuit. And then the third option is the supplemental arc protection breaker plus an OBC AFCI. And quite frankly, there's no supplemental arc protection. There's no standard for that product. The system combination type AFCI with a thermomagnetic breaker plus an OBC AFCI. There is one manufacturer who's offering this listing. It's a listed pair that includes an outlet and a thermomagnetic circuit breaker combined to provide the equivalent protection of a UL 1699 device. So that product does exist on the market. 3 does not, 4 does. I would say it's kind of hard to find a branch feeder type AFCI. So I would say 2 doesn't make sense, but it's an option if you can find one. 1 is the readily available solution. And then there's 5 and 6. 5 is your RMC, so you're protecting the home run circuit. And then 6 is the concrete. So just keep in mind that if you're, that system combination AFCI paired up with an OBC, there are links associated with that you're allowed to have for your AFCI protection. You can't go beyond, and those links are still the same. So as they were last cycle. So none of this changed in reality. The B for dwelling units, these 14 locations are the same 14 locations that we had last cycle and the cycle before. So we have just put these into a list format. And again, NEHAD had a really good concept that we took and we expanded on. And so 210.12 B just lists all of those rooms. 210.12 C, now you'll notice too, and which I forgot, they added 10 amps in each of these. So in the dwelling unit, they added 10. So you have 10, 15, and 20 amp branch circuits. Is there a 10 amp AFCI? No, just like there's no supplemental arc protection, and you probably can't find a branch feeder AFCI. But it's like Anna Marie obligated good seasons lady. It's in there. So if you do start to see 10 amp branch circuits for lighting circuits only, remember, you got to look at the requirements on where you can actually install a 10 amp circuit. We put some restrictions on what can be served. You can't reserve a receptacle outlet on a 10 amp circuit because we don't make 10 amp receptacles. So but you can do that on lighting circuits. And if it's in a residential dwelling unit in any of those rooms in A, you're going to need to have AFCI, but we don't make a 10 amp AFCI yet. So in dormitory units, we've got the 10 amp AFCI, and then we add these 6 rooms. So you have bedrooms, living rooms, hallways, closets, bathrooms, and similar rooms. And that has not changed. That was the same as it was. We just added it into a list format. Now you got your other occupancies. What we added here was areas designed for use exclusively as sleeping quarters in fire stations, police stations, ambulance stations, rescue stations, ranger stations, and similar locations. So that is a new requirement for the 2023 code. Not a dwelling unit, but I'm just threw it in there because it's a bonus question. All right. So now we're going to get out of AFCIs. 230.71. Now 230.71, I don't know if I have it here. 230. Geez. you know that these items, the meter centers were the problem. So this is the 2020 code put in this provision that said, look, we're gonna try, what they were trying to address was, remember, we put the line side barrier requirements in to barrier off the line side service entrance equipment, service overcurrent protected device. And we said, look, panel boards, you can't do 6 disconnects in a panel board anymore, period. You're going to have to put a main breaker in a panel board. Can't have a panel board with 6 disconnects because of that big bus that's in the middle. Well, meter centers have the same problem. Now, the standards are trying to figure out how to address a meter center to where you can open an enclosure for a circuit breaker and not have anything else exposed, barrier off the line side, and still have 6 disconnects. But I'm telling you, it's going to be a tough one. So what we did was we made a change where we recognized that in 230, we said, look, meter centers, we added a line item in 230.71. We added a specific line item, and I just gotta find it here. Here we go. We added this: metering centers with a main service disconnecting means in each metering center. Now, we added that in 230.71.5, but we did not remove it from 4, which says service disconnects in switchgear, transfer switches, or metering centers, where each disconnect is located in a separate compartment. So that's what we're struggling with right now, is how do you create a metering center with circuit breakers in separate compartments? And it would be like saying, how do I make a panel board with circuit breakers in separate compartments? I don't know that the standard's going to get there. They're trying, but I don't know that they're going to get there with language that will actually make it manufacturable and cost effective. So metering centers, be mindful, that's going to be a challenge. If you use meter centers, that's going to be a challenge for you. And this doesn't impact residential, but unless you have a house like Joseph Wages where you have motor control centers, but most of us don't have that. So anyway. So that's a big change. Emergency disconnects. Remember, this was we called it the firefighter disconnect. So we have 230.85. Now, I'll tell you, here's what's happening. So you have emergency disconnects for 1 and 2 family dwelling units. An emergency disconnecting means shall be installed. The disconnecting means shall be installed in a readily accessible outdoor location within sight of the dwelling unit. There's a discussion about rating. There's the grouping requirements. And then there's the disconnect and the different methods. And those methods didn't change. You have the service disconnect. You have a meter disconnect integral with the meter mounting equipment, not marked as suitable only for use as service equipment. You have other listed disconnect switch or circuit breaker that is marked suitable for use as service equipment, but not marked as suitable only for use as service equipment. So they added some clarity there. I mean, I don't think that's anything huge, but you do have to understand that language if you're using that disconnect. And they added replacements. Where service equipment is replaced, all of the requirements of this section shall apply. There is an exception for when you have meter sockets, service entrance connectors, or related raceways and fittings are replaced. The requirement of the section shall not apply. And there's identifications of other isolation disconnects. They got rid of the word emergency there. God only knows why. Where equipment for isolation of other energy sources systems is not located adjacent to the emergency disconnect, blah, 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 blah. So they do have that. And they have a marking requirement. So they reorganize this section for you. And most of the changes aren't that significant because they're tweaking, but just be mindful that that they did reorganize that. Now, they did add another area. There we go. Here's your other area. 225 outdoor circuits. So I'll tell you the discussion that we had on panel 10 on this one. If So here's what you had. Here was the example that we were given. The service is, say, out at the road, and maybe if it's even down the road, and you may not even know that service is for which service is for which home on that road. What they wanted to do, instead of putting the emergency disconnect out there on the road, they wanted to put it near the house. So you're going to have an outside feeder. So if your service is out there at the road, then you're going to have a Article 225 feeder that has to feed the structure. And it says you have to have an emergency disconnect at a readily accessible outdoor location for 1 and 2 family dwellings that are served by feeders. So you have the services in 230 and these outside feeders in 225 to address that scenario where the service is out there at the road, for example. And they want it within readily accessible at that dwelling unit. So that's sort of what they did in 225.41. All right, so the emergency disconnect is important. Surge is another area that got some love. 230.67. 230.67. You have a 220 in 2023 we expanded. Remember, 2020 code saw the first requirement for surge in dwelling units. 2023 expanded those requirements. 230.67. So let's go to 230.67. Because I'll tell you what they did. Tell you what they did. All right, so 230.67, we separated A, surge protected device, B, location, C, type, replacement, and then ratings. So what they did was in A, they said, look, you need to have it for dwelling units, but also dormitory units, guest rooms and guest suites of hotels and motels, and areas of nursing homes and limited care facilities and used exclusively as patient sleeping rooms. So those locations now have surge. So remember, before it was just dwelling units. They expanded beyond dwelling units. In B, you have the location. It has to be an integral part of the service equipment or immediately adjacent thereto. And I'll tell you, the most important thing is the lead length between that bus and that surge protected device. Don't be extending it. The shorter you can get it, the better off you are, because every inch reduces the level of protection. It increases the let-through voltage. Very important. Excuse me. You can put a type 1 or a type 2, and if the services equipment is replaced, it has to be, you have to follow the rules, so you're going to be putting surge in. And then the ratings. SPDs must have a nominal discharge current rating of not less than 10,000 amps. Now, that's not I don't know why some people feel that that our electricians out there are going to get confused and think that is an interrupting rating or a withstand rating. Nope, this is different. This is just a nominal discharge current rating of 10,000 amps. It's more related to, say, the treads on the tire, how long that piece of that surge device is going, how many hits it can take. So basically the longevity of the device. When these things fail, they fail silently. It's not like a circuit breaker that when they've done their job and given their life, or a fuse that gives its life for your equipment, you know, because the equipment is no longer powered, it's no longer functioning. When a surge gives its life to protect the equipment, you have to actually go down and look at indicating lights. So the concern here, and there's probably some expansion of this requirement in the future for the ratings, but right now it's just the nominal discharge current has to be 10,000 amps. Now, there's a few other areas. 215, very similar requirements for feeders, and then also in 225, the same type of language. Because again, they want the surge close to the structure. You don't want that surge product out there at the road at your service equipment. You want it at the end of that feeder feeding a structure. So It's the same locations, dwelling units, dormitory units, so all of that language is the same in A or B, the surge protective device. Actually in A, the B, the location is the same, the type 1 or 2, the replacements are there, and then the rating, same 10K. So those are just two other areas to be mindful of. So surge saw some expansion beyond dwelling units, but the 225 and the 215 is going to impact your dwelling unit applications, very well could impact the dwelling unit applications. So look at that 215 and 225 requirements. Now, I believe this second to last item, and we're almost done. So this is a big change, I think. 21052, branch circuits. And I'm going to point you to, let's just talk real quick. So added stationary appliances, wall space, any space 2 foot or more in width, fireplaces, stationary appliances. So they added the stationary appliances as well, and fixed cabinets that do not have countertops or similar work surfaces. That's general provisions. And B, they just style manual cleaning up, not a big significant change in B. For example, as required in is replaced with shall be permitted in accordance with. So they're not changing the intent. So B is pretty much the same. C, so island and peninsula. So here's what we did in 21052C. We've gone through this debate. We've had the arguments of how many receptacles do we put on a peninsula or an island. We went through what's the connecting edge. We talked about, in the last cycle, we went to a calculation of area, and we're trying to make life easy. Well, I'll tell you what happened. The Consumer Product Safety Commission sent us a note and shared with us data of the number of children, adults, whomever, who have pulled deep fryers, crock pots off of these locations. Why? Because the receptacle is located below the countertop and the cord drapes over the edge. So what we learned was that promoting that use of cords going over the edge created opportunities for children, elderly, and others to pull grease, deep fryers, etc., from the countertop on top of them. And we looked at the data, and I'll tell you what we did. We said we actually went back and forth. Well, some people, some of the code panel members would say, look, let's make it you're required to have a receptacle on that peninsula or island, and we'll still use the calculation, but all the receptacles have to be in the top, like a pop-up, or two-tiered islands where you can have it on the face, but it can't be extending over. So we had that extreme, to one saying we should not permit a receptacle on an island based on the data that we saw, or a peninsula. And then what we compromised on was that you're not required to put a receptacle on an island or peninsula. But if you do, it has to be on the top. You can't put it below the countertop. So the way we said this, we said receptacle outlets, if installed to serve an island or peninsula countertop or work surface, shall be installed in accordance with 21052C3, and then we'll talk about the receptacle outlet location. If a receptacle outlet is not provided to serve an island or peninsula countertop or work surface, provisions shall be provided at the island or peninsula for future addition of a receptacle outlet to serve the island or peninsula countertop. So we wanted to make sure that power could be there for the future, but that's all we said. So what does provision shall be provided at the island or peninsula for future addition of a receptacle outlet? I'm not sure what that future provision really means, and that's a point of debate. Now, the receptacle outlet location. Receptacle outlet shall be located on or above, but not more than 20 inches above, a countertop or work surface. In a countertop, using receptacle outlet assemblies listed for use in countertops, and then in a work surface, using receptacle outlet assemblies listed for use in work surfaces. And the difference between a receptacle outlet assembly that's for use in a work surface versus a countertop, a work surface has to only be able to withstand like a cup of water hitting it directly, where a where a countertop is like a gallon of water. And they put like a saline solution, they add some stuff in there. So, but in any case, there's a difference between those two, whether the receptacle assembly is for a work surface or a countertop. And that's a little detail. So that's how we addressed the countertops, etc. So in the 2023, so we made it optional, which will probably mean you're not going to see a lot of receptacles in those areas. So bathrooms, general overview, changed the basin to sink. Big deal? Not. We removed an informational note because it said it was duplicate. And then in basements, receptacles supplying only a permanently installed premises security system shall not be considered as meeting the requirements of the basements, garage, and accessory buildings. But in reality, as we said, a premises security system can be in any room. So we would really have to take a look at that one again, because why is it just basement, garages, and accessory buildings? Why isn't it just in the general provision? So, but didn't change. So anyway, and the last one we're going to hit is lighting. So 210.70, lighting outlets shall be installed. And now one of the terms that we added last cycle was this switch or wall mounted control device. Remember, this is like those wireless controllers for lighting. And the concern of people on the panel was, well, I may be able to, in any of my installations, not pull wire down to a lighting switch, where I have a physical wire that I can, if I want to go back to a standard light switch, that I could. Based upon what we did in last cycle with 210.70, you could just put a wireless device, glue it to the wall, not pull a wire to an outlet box behind it, and that controls your lights directly. The concern of the panel was they didn't want to go there, so they said that the switch or wall-mounted control device shall not rely exclusively on a battery unless a means is provided for automatically energizing the lighting outlets upon battery failure. So this is going to drive, in my opinion, it's going to drive the hard wiring. So if you do have a control device that is remotely controlling that light, you're still going to bring the wires down to a switch, because that controller probably relies on a battery as the means to turn something on and off, and they did not want to rely on it. But I think the underlying true concern really is there are many on the code panel that really want to pull a hard wire down to the light switch. So for a lot of different reasons. If I don't want it now and I want it later. And then keep in mind too that Article 404, the scope of Article 404, which is switches, they said the article does not cover wireless control equipment to which circuit conductors are not connected. So they didn't want any part of these wireless controllers. All right, so I would say those are my biggest changes. You got 210.8, you got 210.12, surge, the emergency disconnect, the 6 disconnect rule modification now with the meter centers. That's going to be something to keep your eye on. Islands and peninsulas, saving you some money there, and addressing a concern, and statistics. And then finally the lighting, that whole lighting outlet discussion that we just had. So those are, in my opinion, are some of the significant changes that impact the residential dwelling unit. I hope you got something out of this session. I want to thank you for taking your time and spending time with me. I apologize again for having to record this one, but I just hope that you got something out of our hour plus together. Remember to stay safe, and please stay healthy. Take care. Until next week, God bless. This is Tom Dimitrovich signing out for IAEI News Live. See you next week.